Okay, letting everyone in now.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome, welcome.
Hello.
Hi. We're going to give people a little bit to get in here and then we'll get started. All right. People still joining, so I'm just going to give a little bit more time, but this is how to cast on. But we are going to do some advanced cast-ons. So even if you already know how to cast on, stick around. And we are going to be going pretty fast through a lot of different techniques and ideas and just talking a lot. So we have a lot of information to cram into this half hour here. But it looks like we're getting almost everybody joined.
Yeah.
So we'll just give another minute. I still see some connecting signs coming. So
I think we're doing pretty well.
all
We got
right,
a few more
everybody
who are
should
coming
get
in,
there.
but we can probably start with introductions and stuff.
All right. Yeah, let's get started. I'm Suzanne Nielsen, and Laura is also with us. We're co-hosting this one together about casting on. Yay! So, and this is the 23rd Tutorial Tuesday that we've done. So thanks for coming with us. Remember, you can go back and look at all of the previous recordings and sign up. You do have to sign up each time. So we have one more coming up next week, and that is the bind off one. And yeah, so let's get started here. So casting on, I am going to share my screen.
The other thing I will tell you is we're going to give away 2 $20 gift certificates. I will tell you when to get ready because we'll be doing that in the chat at the sort of intermission partway through.
Yes. And we're asking questions, right, Laura? Are you going to ask questions for those?
I am going to ask questions. So,
all right, so, yeah,
be sure you're paying attention.
All right. So first, I just wanted to show you what the long tail cast on looks like. And so this is the general long tail cast on. We're actually, we might get to that one at the end if people want to see it, but I just wanted to kind of have a baseline for one that it seems like, a lot of people know this one. But I'm going to start out with the other, super basic cast on, and that is the knitted cast on. So for the knitted cast on, you start with just a slip knot on your needle. And then like the name of it sounds, you are just knitting your cast on. So you have your slip knot on and you go into the stitch and knit the stitch, but instead of slipping the stitch off the needle, you pull this out a little bit and then you place it back on your left needle. And then you can kind of tighten it up a little bit. And then you continue that way. So you go into the stitch, just like you're knitting, and then place the stitch back on. And we're going to talk about the different times you need that. Or I guess I can just mention to you, this is, a pretty basic one that a lot of people learn when they first start knitting, but it's also really good to use when you're adding sleeves or you have to cast on, sorry, get some focus here, cast on in the middle of the row. And I'm just going to do a few more here. So knit the stitch, place it back on, and then I'm going to show you one other stitch, and then Laura's going to tell us a little bit more about those. So that's the knitted cast on. And I'm going to also right now show you the cabled cast on, because the cabled cast on is actually very similar to the knitted cast on. So for the cabled cast on, instead of going into the stitch like you normally do, like you're knitting, you're actually going to split and go between the stitches. So if you can see here, you're just going to go between the stitches and then pull up your loop and place that back on the needle. So just like you placed it back on with the knitted cast on, but the cabled cast on is just going between the stitches, grabbing your yarn and pulling it through and then placing that stitch back on the needle. And Yeah, so I'll do a few more here. Maybe we'll switch over to Laura and she can share a little bit why you would want to do those two cast-ons.
Yeah. So the knitted cast on, part of the reason a lot of people start with that is because it's very much like knitting. You are making the knitting stitch and then you're just putting it on the needle rather than dropping the previous stitch. It is a pretty elastic cast on. It does have a nice kind of tidy edge. And I did see a question from Janice about whether it's loose. You do kind of pull the stitches a little bit tighter. And for instance, it would provide a neater edge and a more stable edge. Sometimes when you, for instance, are casting on stitches for the underarms, if you're knitting a top-down sweater and you're separating the sleeves, when you go to cast on for the underarms, sometimes they'll say to use the backwards loop cast on, which is just where you twist the yarn around the needle. And I find that those tend to get really loosey-goosey and kind of hard to control your tension with. And so the knitted cast on is a little bit better for something like that. The other place the knitted cast on is really good is if, say, you're knitting a dolman sweater and you're knitting from the bottom up and you're then adding stitches for the sleeves. It's a really nice way to cast on stitches kind of at the underarm where you would cast on for the sleeves if your sleeve is just going to be straight. The cabled cast on is a little bit firmer and a little bit less elastic. So you wouldn't necessarily want it on an edge that you want to really stretch. It's going to create a little bit of a more defined edge. Some of the places that I saw this, they did say you could use it as a cast on for dolman sleeves, but one of the other places that I saw it used quite a bit is for buttonholes. For instance, when you're casting on, if you cast off stitches for a buttonhole and then on the next row you cast them back on to create the buttonhole, it creates a slightly firmer edge because you know those buttonholes stretch and then sometimes they don't hold the button tightly. So if you want to create, that's where you would want to create potentially a slightly firmer edge where you didn't want it to pull quite as much. So those are the first two that we're covering. We did have a request for the Chinese waitress cast on. We did not prepare that one for today. I don't know if you have that one in your repertoire, and if we have time at the end, we might be able to do that. Somebody asked if we have larger needles or yarn. I don't know if you have a way to potentially move the camera just a little bit closer to your needles.
Oh yeah, maybe I'll try moving it closer, but then sometimes it has a hard time focusing.
Yeah.
One thing just to make sure too, if you have it in gallery view, then sometimes it's a little smaller. So you might want to put it on, speaker only view. That might help you. But I'm going to switch back to the camera now and show you. I just knit a little ways so you can see what the knitted and the cabled cast on look like. And then we're going to move to our next one.
So, and just as a little background, part of the reason that we selected some of the cast-ons that we did is because they are used in a lot of the project kits. So these are techniques that we cover in some of our other knit-alongs, and so we wanted to share them with you so that you could see how to start the projects.
Yes, and these first ones especially are just some more common ones. So here you can see at the beginning is where I was doing the knitted cast on, and then I just knit a few rows. So that's what it looks like. But you can see how the cabled cast on, it does have a firmer, some patterns call for it because it's a little bit more of a decorative edge. And yeah, so that is the knitted cast on and then the cabled cast on. All right, so next we're going to jump into, let's see, Laura, did you want to talk about the more elastic ones, or maybe I'll just show them and then we can talk about how you might want to, when you might want to use a more elastic cast on. So first, let's go ahead and, sorry, I cut my yarn. So a more elastic cast ons, there's so many, so it was hard for us to choose which one we wanted to do, but there's like a crocheted cast on. The one that I really like the best for an elastic cast on is the tubular cast on, which we have used in a couple other projects. So I'm going to show the tubular cast on. It is going to go quite quick, so the idea is that you can watch these videos later. But for the a tubular cast on, it does require kind of the slingshot hold that you do for the long tail cast on. So it's the same kind of hold. But that's where the similarities end. It's pretty different after that. So it's going to be an alternation between making knit and purl stitches. So the first one that's on my needle, I'm going to kind of consider that a knit stitch. Then I'm going to go and do a purl stitch. And a purl stitch, you take your needle tip and go all the way around. So up, all the way around underneath both yarns. And then you're going to grab that bottom yarn and bring it under the top yarn. And that creates a little purl stitch. If you see here, you can see a little bump there. And now I'm going to create a knit stitch. Let me see if I can get that out of the way better. Sorry. All right, so now I'm going to create the knit stitch by going underneath and then between the yarns and grabbing that top yarn and bringing it underneath the bottom yarn. So that was a knit stitch. So now we're just going to alternate between those purl and knit stitches. And you can see that when it's laying on my needles, it looks a little bit more like a knit stitch. So again, for the purl stitch, you go up, around, grab that bottom one from underneath and bring it under that top needle or top yarn. And for the knit stitch, you go all the way underneath, grab that top yarn and bring it under the bottom yarn. So you can, going up leaves a bump. You could say up, bump. So you go up and all the way around to grab that one, and that gives you a bump, or you duck down and through and grab it, and that gives you a knit stitch that's a little smoother. So up for a bump and then under for a smooth stitch. All right, I'm just going to do 2 more. And then we're going to do the setup row. So then you kind of twist your stitches here at the end. You can just twist your thumb up around. And then for this particular cast on, you do have to do 2 setup rows.
We're going to cover where you use it in just a minute.
Yes, yes.
That's on our list.
For the setup row, you do a knit stitch, and then you bring your yarn to the front and you just slip this stitch. So you can read your knitting. When it looks like it's a knit, then you're going to knit it. And if it looks like it's a purl, then you bring your yarn to the front and slip the stitch with the yarn in front. And then bring your yarn back, knit, bring it to the front, slip, purlwise, knit, bring your yarn to the front and slip purlwise, knit. So you're knitting every other stitch. Oops, I slipped that one off, but I will grab it, bring your yarn to the front and slip. And then we do 1 more row that's exactly the same as that one. So now we're essentially working the stitches that we slipped before, but it's still a knit, bring your yarn to the front and slip. Knit, bring your yarn to the front, slip. And then this one goes really nicely into ribbing. So it's an extremely elastic cast on, and it goes really well into ribbing. All right, so then I would, now that completes the cast on. Now I can start my project, and let's let Laura tell us more about these.
Okay, so one of the reasons we're talking about elastic cast-ons is because in a lot of projects, you are going to want your edging to be kind of loose and stretchy. The stereotypical example is you're knitting a sweater and you knit the neckline too tight and you cannot get it over your head. But other examples are if you knit the cuff of your sock too tightly, and particularly if you're doing top-down socks, if you knit the cuff too tightly, it's going to be hard to get over your ankle, because that kind of diagonal where your ankle is wider than your calf. Now, of course, one of the reasons that we like the tubular cast on, well, there are a couple reasons. The tubular cast on lends itself really, really well to ribbing, which of course, if you are creating things that have an edge that you'd like to be kind of snug on your head, or kind of snug around your neck, or kind of snug around your cuffs, but you want it to be loose enough that it can stretch and pull over things, you're going to want to use something like a tubular cast on, because it's going to give you a really nice stretchy edge, but it's also going to go easily very directly into ribbing, which will give you kind of some nice cuddling, grabbing where you want it. But you would definitely want to use elastic cast-ons for the hem of your sweater if you're going bottom up, or the collar if you're going top down, for the brim of your hat, because you want to be able to fit it over your head. And so the tubular is just a really nice way to do that. The thing about the tubular cast on is it makes your edges almost look like they have been machine created, because the stitches kind of roll over the edge, and it's sort of impossible to tell where things start and where things end. So it's also a really nice technique if you're doing it on, like I said, the cuffs and hems of your sweaters, or even the brim of your hat, because it just gives it a really nice finished edge, and nothing sticking out. You know, sometimes if you use, well, for instance, with a stockinette edge, a lot of times it will roll and it will show the backside of your fabric, which is totally a style, and that may be exactly what you want for your project, but it may not be what you want for your project. You also may have knit shawls where you've knit the first stitches on the shawls too tightly, and then when you go to block the diagonal, it doesn't block out the way you want it to, or where you've slipped your stitches not quite loosely enough. So that would be a reason why you want elastic cast-ons. Like I said, there are somewhat fewer reasons why you'd want a really firm cast on, but a buttonhole would be a great example of why you would want that to be a really stable edge. So I think that was kind of what we had for those.
Yeah, I'm going to show you, I'll go ahead and share again and show you what it looks like after I just went a little bit more. So you can see here, the edge just really flows into itself. So here's the front, and then it really just flows into the opposite side. And you do sometimes want to use a little bit smaller needles, I would say, in this cast on. But I'm going to show you one other just trick, is that sometimes I use this tubular cast on when I'm doing double knitting. And you can use the cast on with two colors, and it's the same. You just, I'll show you quickly, but here's what the edge looks like. So in double knitting, it really just rolls into itself. It doesn't even look like it's a cast on edge. So that's a really fun thing to do. So with two colors, let's see here. With two colors, you can, and this is also a trick for long tail. If you'll notice with that, with the, sorry, with the tubular cast on, I did have a long tail. And so you have to estimate how much tail you need. But if you don't want to have to estimate how long your tail is, you can just pull from the inside and the outside of the ball and do a slip knot like this and put your slip knot on your needle. And then you have your tail. It gives you a few extra ends to weave in, but if you're going to cast on like 200 stitches, it could be worth it.
You can also do this in projects where you have multiple balls of yarn. So if you're knitting a sweater, you can do your first cast on this way with 2 of the balls of yarn. And it'll give you an extra end to weave in at kind of the beginning and the end of the cast on, but then you don't have to worry about the fact that if you have to cast on 200 stitches, you don't have to worry about how long your tail needs to be.
Yep. So it's totally worth it. And this is, again, I'm just showing you that you can do, it's actually called the Italian two-color tubular cast on, I think is the official, one of the official names. But yeah, you can do that. I'm doing the exact same motions, but I have one color on the top and one color on the bottom, and I'm just alternating between the two. And it works really well to go into ribbing, or to go into double knitting, sorry. So that is the Italian tubular cast on. And one other cast on that we're going to get to today, or maybe possibly more, we'll see, is a provisional cast on.
Do we want to take just a quick break to do the trivia questions and stuff?
Oh, yeah. Let's do it.
And then we can do the rest. The only other thing I want to show you, and this is not something that I'm selling, I'm not in any way affiliated with this, and Zen doesn't sell this book, but this is a book called 54 Step-by-Step Methods for Casting On and Binding Off by Leslie Ann Bester. This is a great little book. I know a lot of us turn to the internet these days, and that's wonderful too. It has lists of all these different cast-ons, and then for each cast on, it shows you why you would want to use them, what about them makes them special, are they good for elastic cast-ons, etc. And then you've got all your pictures in there in all your steps. So if you find yourself wanting to try lots of cast-ons, this is a great little book. I keep this on my bookshelf and pull it out when I need it. So $20 gift card time. I have two. I'm going to ask two questions. So make sure your chat windows are open, particularly if you're on a mobile device. First question. What was the first cast on that Suzanne demonstrated? First one to answer wins.
Whoa, you guys are
Whoa,
fast.
okay. So it looks like, oh, well, technically, okay. I realized that the first one that she showed was long tail, but the first one that she demonstrated was knitted cast on. So I am going to go with
Well,
Katrine.
I think there's before that. Did you look more before that?
Katrine is the first one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Katrine, or it might be pronounced Katrina. I can't tell. What you want to do is you want to look down in the section where you can message, and look in the to column and message Zen Yarn Garden. Go ahead and send her your email address, and she will send you a $20 gift card.
Ooh,
so that is the first one. Second one, I will say, what cast on did we demonstrate that would be good for ribbed edges? Okay, it looks like I was hoping for tubular, and it looks like that one was hold on, my screen keeps refreshing. Looks like the first one to answer tubular was Nancy Hubner. And Nancy, same thing, go ahead and select Zen Yarn Garden from the drop-down list and send her your email address, and she will send you a $20 gift card. So we are going to keep going with one more method that we had prepared, and then we'll see how much time we have left, if we have time for questions or anything else.
Yes.
So back over to you, Suzanne.
All right. I'm going to share my screen again. So this one is my favorite for a provisional cast on. And like I said, there's several different provisional cast-ons that you can use. One is a crocheted. You can like do a crochet chain and then pick up in the crochet chain. You can also, I don't know, there's several other ones, but this is one that I find particularly simple and easy, and I'll explain why too. But what you do need for this one is a long circular needle. So you have your circular needle, and you actually hold the needles together parallel with each other, and take your slip knot and place it on the bottom needle if you're holding them like together. So I place the slip knot on the bottom needle, and then we're just going to wrap the yarn around. I know it seems kind of bizarre, but that's all we need to do. So we'll take the yarn tail, we'll wrap from the back to the front. So that counts as 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I'm just going to do 10 here. All right, so I've wrapped it around. You can count if you lose count. You can just count the wraps on the top of the top needle. And then all I'm going to do is hold my yarn to the back and kind of pinch it to stabilize it. And then I'm actually going to pull out the bottom needle so that the stitches go onto that cable. So those stitches are just hanging out on the cable now. And I'll just pull it so that I leave a loop here on this side. But then I also have a loop to work with. And then I'm just going to start knitting. So I'll knit across those stitches just like normal. And the cable is kind of a little funky and it's kind of in the way, but it doesn't matter. We just knit across those stitches until we get to the end. So we've knit all the stitches. You'll see now my slip knot is hanging out on this cable. I actually don't count the slip knot as a stitch, so that it just hangs out there for a little bit. But that's it, then we're done. So what happens then is you turn your work and you keep knitting basically on the stitches that are on the top needle, and the stitches that are on the cable, they just can hang out there. You can, if you would like, you can move those stitches onto a spare just piece of scrap yarn or a stitch holder or whatnot. But the kind of nice thing is that they can just stay on the cable and they can hang out there until you need them again. And then they're just ready to knit. So that's one nice thing about them. But it's also just a really easy, fast way to do that provisional cast on and get those stitches already on your needles. So I'm going to knit one more row and then I'll kind of show you what they look like. Then I could either, after I got a ways, I could bind these off, and then I could come back to these stitches, and I could push my needle into these stitches, and then they're ready to go. So sometimes people like, a bind off edge. They want two of the exact same edges on a scarf or something. So you could leave these stitches and then come back and just do your bind off, and it would be exactly the same. You'd be binding off on both sides. Or even I've seen some patterns where you would now kind of start knitting in the round. And so then you'd be like growing out from the center. That's kind of a cool thing to do. I actually have a pattern I was going to show you. This is, these are called the Stitch School mitts, and they are cast on here. So you actually cast on long ways with this exact method, and you knit the whole mitt, and then you come back and you do like a little Kitchener stitch. So there's really no seam at all. And then you do an I-cord bind off, which we'll show next week, and some more techniques. But it's a neat way to have, a seamless nothing involved. Yeah, so any other way where you would want a provisional cast on, Laura? Do you want to?
Sure. Well, so the deal is that your provisional cast on is usually a temporary cast on. Suzanne showed us how to do it without waste yarn, but there are other techniques that do use waste yarn, and I had a couple tips for that. You want to choose a waste yarn that is smaller in gauge than the yarn that you're working with. You also want to choose something that's relatively smooth because you want to be able to pull it out of those stitches fairly easily. So this is useful when you're adding a border. A lot of lace shawls that have motifs that are similar on both halves will start with a provisional cast on at the back of the neck or the middle of the rectangular wrap, and then you'll knit half the wrap, and then you'll go back to the beginning and knit the other half of the wrap the same way. So a little bit like the scarf technique you were talking about, but I have seen quite a few like rectangular stole patterns if you're very into lace. And so the other thing you could use this for is if you're doing some kind of an applied hem or edging or border, if you're doing like a knitted on lace border at the end, sometimes they have you pick up those stitches, sometimes they have you do a provisional cast on beforehand. So that's mostly what I had to say about that. We are, is the provisional cast on the same as the Turkish cast on? That I don't know.
I don't think so. I think.
Let me see if my book has the Turkish cast on, and then I'll be able to tell you. And I don't know that we're going to get through the Chinese waitress cast on.
Yeah, we might have to do an add-on, another cast on, because there's also like an I-cord cast on that's really great. I also really like a slip knot cast on, and it's really like you're just making a series of slip knots. It's nice because it's not a long tail, so you don't have to, estimate your yarn, but it's also, or use the trick where you have two skeins and do a slip knot. But it's very stretchy also, and it looks really good for an edge that's like garter stitch. I would say it's a good one for that.
You are right. That actually does sound like the Turkish cast on, because you're wrapping the yarn around both needles.
Oh, okay.
So, yes.
So yeah. Yeah.
You were right. I learned something tonight. So we're pretty close on time at 6:30. Does anybody have any questions about what we covered tonight? So I did show you this book. We, if you'd like to see a tutorial with more different kinds of cast-ons, we are going to be taking a break after next week for August. We're going to take August as a wee bit of summer vacation, but we will be back in the fall with more sessions. So if you have some ideas of things you'd like to see, you are welcome to send us those. And then next week we'll be covering bind-offs, and we'll cover some of the bind-offs that match the cast-ons. But as I said, we're trying to cover cast-ons. The tubular cast-on is what we're using in our VT knit along right now. And so we are also going to cover the I-cord cast-off because we've done a number of Stephen West patterns, and he loves the I-cord cast-off.
Yes, and this is the one of my patterns. It's the Strolling on Cloud 9, and it uses an I-cord cast-off. I think I-cord cast-offs, they look really nice and clean. So
yeah, they're a really nice finished edge, but we will definitely, that was the Strolling on Cloud 9 kit, just for anyone who had questions about it. But I guess that's probably about it for this week.
Gosh, sorry, we tried to pack in a lot of information. Really, we just want to kind of like give you some ideas so that you start thinking about these things, and give you a resource to maybe look back and see a quick refresher, but also give you the inspiration to look for some different things and know when you would want to use them. And so thanks so much for joining us, and we will see you next week. Next week, we're going to be, like Laura said, doing cast-offs. And thanks for joining.